Dean Chelpon, licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist from Virginia, with more than 2 decades of experience in private practice working with individuals and families. His talk this morning is Healing the Family Dynamic, Tools for Managing. Please welcome Dean Chelpon.
I just want to start off by saying that Heather and Susan, I was so moved by your 2 stories. And as I sit here pondering your loss, I was reminded that life is loss. For all that we gain in life, we lose. We might lose a friend, a child, a day, a chance, a hope, and finally, life itself. To oppose the pain of loss, we use a human glue, and that is the force of love. And that love creates connection, and that in the end, that's what saves us. To connect, to risk being vulnerable with one another, to accept fear, to accept that life will never be the same. I'm trying not to choke up, because one thing you need to know about me is, yes, I'm a psychotherapist. I have more than a couple of decades of experience, but I'm also the father of a teen with PANDAS. And I know something of the loss of what life was supposed to be when my wife and I, who's somewhere out in the audience, decided to have children. And almost 19 years ago, we had twin boys, and one of them was diagnosed about 6-7 years ago. So if you will, I want you to just sit back. Don't feel the need to take notes. I just want you to be with me in the next few minutes. If you find something interesting in the slides, take a picture of it, send me a text. My information is right there. I'll send you the whole slideshow if you want. Just be with me, because I'm going to try and give you all a path forward today to establish this connection with your kids. I'm going to talk today in sort of 3 stages. I want to talk about what our kids look like in non-acute places, because this is when intervention, I believe, can be most effective. And then we're going to talk about the acute phase and some of the symptoms and what we can do to support our kids during an acute phase. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some treatment methods that are used in psychotherapy. One thing you need to know about how I practice, yes, I do work with PANDAS kids, but most of what I do is I work with PANDAS parents. Susan, you spoke earlier about the need for self-care. And to the parents in the room, this is the primary thing that you can do for your child. And in doing that, you're more able to be with them and to teach them some of the skills that they're going to need to take care of themselves. When our kids are floundering, these are some of the things that we see. It can compromise the development of some skills for coping that we need in life. Emotional regulation, the ability to be flexible and adaptable, frustration tolerance, executive functioning, like working memory, the ability to organize oneself, problem solving, speech expression, social skills, expressing oneself, being able to self-advocate, label one's feelings, put a voice to who they are in a given moment, and cognitive flexibility. It's important to use these non-flare moments to help our kids build coping skills that are going to make them more resilient and make them more capable to cope with when the next flare comes. Adapting an environment to environmental changes and demands, internalizing standards of conduct, self-regulation, this is what's going to guide them. So how do we do that? In working with parents, one of the things that, and families, one of the things that I try to do is help them engage their children in non-acute phases. This is when the getting is good. In something called collaborative problem solving, or CPS, the good kind of CPS. I'm glad you got that joke. CPS comes out of the work of Ross Greene, who's a theorist at Harvard University. He wrote a very famous book called The Explosive Child. I don't like the title, but the truth hurts sometimes. One thing to know before we start to engage in a conversation about collaborative problem solving is that you got to know when to use the approach. There are times in life, during a flare, that collaborative problem solving is just not possible. This is what he would call a plan A moment. Collaborative problem solving itself is something he refers to as plan B. And plan B happens when the moment is a teachable one. It happens when it's not imperative that your demand be met. And it happens when you can figure out a workable solution with your child. It happens in 3 stages. Stage 1 is the empathy stage. In the empathy stage, you're simply trying to gather information about your kid's experience during an identified problem that they might be having. And it's important that you don't move off of this stage until that child is absolutely certain that you got it, that you understand where they are coming from. Let's take, for example, you've got Johnny, who's a PANDAS kid, and he's having an issue on the playground during school with Chad on the soccer field. In the empathy stage, you're simply trying to gather information. So I notice that you're having a tough time with Chad on the soccer field. So tell me what that's about. What's going on? What is it that's frustrating you about it? How does it make you feel? What are you thinking when Chad's starting to laugh at you? In stage 2, when you are certain that Chad knows that you can understand his experience. You don't need to agree with their experience. You need to understand it. That's the definition of empathy. Then you can move to stage 2, which is where you get to define your concerns. So here's what I'm thinking, Johnny. I see how Chad is treating you, and it sucks. Sounds really bad. But I'm concerned about what your reaction was and how you could get kicked off the field. Now, when you're doing this, it's really important. Do not get reactive. Reactivity is not our friend when it comes to dealing with our children, period, but especially when we're dealing with a child with PANDAS. It's important not to lecture them. And then, when you are certain that Johnny gets where you're coming from, not before then, you can move to stage 3, which is what ideas can we come up with, you and me together, to try and prevent this from happening. One of the things that helps a kid mitigate the severity of a flare is this kind of connection in these quieter moments. The ability for them to experience feeling heard. Their ability to put a voice to a feeling, and it matters. The ability to develop skills for self-advocacy and self-regulation, it matters. My wife and I did this with our son with varying amounts of success over a very long period of time. But I can tell you that over that time, my son is able to now identify the beginnings of a flare. And he's able to identify what he might need before that flare gets out of control. Dad, I think it's time to call Dr. Latimer and get me an infusion of steroids because I'm about to blow. Or, Dad, my ears are turning red. That's a telltale for him. And that's a miracle that he's able to do those kinds of things to advocate for self. And I think that this was a big part of how that happened. I think that this can create a real foundation for the bad times. Let's talk for a minute about those bad times, about those more challenging times, the acute phase of a flare. What are some of the symptoms? What are some of the things that we see? Anxious protest from our kids, anxious avoidance, compulsions, ruminations, OCD type of symptoms, mood disturbance, rage. Oh, dear Lord, did we see rage. I can't tell you how many holes and how many walls and doors in my... I'm really good at drywall now. Sensory discomfort, sleep disturbance, fatigue, pain, trouble thinking things through and planning, which is why CPS is so valuable. School stress. We have to assess when we see a flare coming, what our child's capacity is, so that we can take it to the next level, whether it be in a therapist's office or in a treating physician's office. Is my child able to eat the way he normally eats? Is he able to sleep? Is he able to sleep alone? Is he able to control compulsions? Stop crying? Is he able to avoid violence? Can he be away from home? Can he go to school? Can he get up early in the morning, even if they haven't, because they haven't slept? Are they still in class? How many of you people in here have kids that are being homeschooled right now? Show of hands. There you go. Are they able to concentrate? Are they able to do homework? Are they able to be quiet? And I don't mean like be quiet, but sit in emotional stillness. Sometimes these acute phases are going to erupt. You're going to see attacks, physical and otherwise, come up without warning. Very uncharacteristic aggression, biting, kicking, hitting, threats to family, threats to siblings, threats to friends, shocking threats, language that you wouldn't have ever thought you'd hear from your kid. I think it's important to know that there are sometimes some ways of mitigating some of this. You've got to know whether, I think it's helpful to know some of the precipitating factors when it gets to this point. Hunger, thirst, pain, sensory overload, change in routine. If you take those 5 precipitating factors, is there a time of day when those precipitating factors sort of come together to form a perfect storm? It's after school, right? That's why when I work with parents, I think it's really important to educate them that after-school period of time is crucial to not demand a whole hell of a lot of anything from your child, because they need to reconstitute. Strategies to address rage, as if there are a lot of strategies, right? You've got to avoid punishment. This will only escalate things. Your child in the midst of a rage is not your child's fault. It's because he is lagging in certain very important skills caused by a flare. It's also really important, this is easy as falling off a cliff, to not be reactive. When I work with parents, I usually give them a scale of 1 to 10, okay? I will give them up to 3.5 or 4. If your level of reactivity is over a 3.5 or 4, what's happening is not about your kid. What's happening is about your own feeling petrified, out of control, kind of scared. And I think we have to accept this as part of our regimen of self-care, is to be aware of that. Distraction is sometimes of use. Depends on the age of the kid. An older kid, distraction's not going to work as well. Again, try and minimize some of these risk factors. Sleep, hunger, abrupt transitions. Create a safe house, including a family safety plan. That might include doing things that are really difficult for you. Again, a sense of loss, things you never thought you'd have to do, like making sure windows can't open easily. We don't want fire hazards. Locking up your sharps. And have clearly set limits. Using your therapist or your child's therapist on what's going to happen in your house when there's violence. And work with your kid to establish the fact that sometimes 911 is going to have to be called. Now, I don't want to get into the how-tos of that, but there are how-tos of that. If somebody wants to come up to me offline, I'd be happy to talk to you. But I don't want to, it's very complicated. But kids are sometimes hospitalized as a result of a 911 call when you don't want them to be hospitalized. Now we'll talk a little bit about OCD and OCD behaviors. If your child is worrying about germs and getting sick, that's a telltale symptom. Extreme fear is about bad things happening, or about them being bad, or something wrong, something horrible is about to occur, and I might be the one to do it. Feeling that things have to happen in just the right way, and they're not comfortable until things feel just right to them. Disturbing or unwanted thoughts or images about hurting others, about them hurting others. Compulsions such as hand washing, excessive checking, repeating actions. Mental compulsions. A lot of the parents that I work with, if I say, what of all of this scares you the most? I would have always thought the risk factors of violence. But it's this. And why? Because nothing more than, there's nothing more that tortures a child than living through these symptoms. These symptoms are also what often leads to the violence. It's the only thing they feel they can control to try and make it stop. Strategies for addressing it. I think that it's important to set limits with your kids. While it's difficult to see your child in this kind of distress, it's more difficult for them to recover from these OCD symptoms if you don't set limits. For example, if your child is going to tell you that you can't enter their room unless you change your clothes, what do we do? What I like to tell parents that an appropriate response is, I know this is difficult for you, and I know this is your OCD, but I'm not going to change my clothes before I enter your room. Otherwise, we are feeding the beast. Your child is likely going to respond with a meltdown, some kind of outburst, when you start to consistently set limits, but they're also going to become used to your consistency over time, and they're going to start to respect those limits, hopefully. Be firm. You need to be clear with your child that you're not allowing their OCD to rule you or them, and you've got to follow through on what you say to them. Remind your child that this is not about hurting or punishing them, because we're not about punishing what's not their fault. But we're not going to allow OCD, by the way, name the OCD. Give it a name, Mr. Bossy. I don't care. I'm not going to allow Mr. Bossy to control our lives. Being firm this way means that you are willing to follow through on what you communicate to your child. If you tell them that the water is going to be turned off in 10 minutes when they're in the shower, you've got to follow through on that. Make sure that your child's other caregivers take the same approach. This is really important. If there's a grandmother or an aunt or a godmother involved in this kid's life, it's important that you educate them to do the same. And don't accommodate or enable your kid's OCD. Accommodating OCD means that you're taking part in a child's rituals or changing your behavior to allow that ritual to happen. With accommodation, the main motivation is not to upset your child rather than uphold the ritual that you believe to be necessary. It can include changing your clothes because that's what your child wants you to do before you get into their room, or giving your child 10 kisses in one spot of the head instead of just one kiss. Rewashing only the affected child's dishes and using a separate dish towel for them. These are ways of accommodating your kid's OCD that in the long run aren't good for them. You want to praise and reward your child's efforts for managing their OCD. I'm really proud of how you're tackling this. And we try to try and look at the impact of chronic illness on other siblings in the family, as well as ourselves. I look forward to meeting you all later today. I want to thank you for your time and your kindness and your attention. Have a great rest of the morning.
Thank you, Dean.